The Galactic Council demanded combat, until an alien general told of Deathworld horrors. The order came through at 0340 hours, and nobody asked if I wanted to go. Sergeant Ilan Voss, they said, report to Docking Bay 7 with full kit. No mission briefing, no destination listed, just a transport number and a time, and the clear implication that asking questions would be a poor career decision. I had been sleeping for exactly 90 minutes after a 14-hour perimeter shift on Colony Pharaoh 6, which is a frozen rock orbiting a dim red star that nobody outside the Frontier Service has ever heard of, and which I had come to think of as the universe's way of punishing people for minor administrative errors in a previous life. I grabbed my kit bag. I did not ask questions. The transport was not a military vessel. That was the first strange thing. It was long and silver and completely featureless on the outside, the kind of ship that belongs to no flag and carries no weapons and docks at places that do not appear on standard navigation charts. The inside smelled like recycled air and something faintly chemical, the way hospitals smell when they are trying very hard not to smell like hospitals. Ambassador Delara Ose was waiting in the briefing room. She was a tall woman with short gray hair and the kind of calm that comes not from ease, but from having been genuinely alarmed so many times that the alarm mechanism has simply worn smooth. She handed me a cup of coffee without being asked. That was when I knew this was serious. The Galactic Council, she said, has issued a combat demonstration mandate against the human species. I drank my coffee. What does that mean? It means they want to watch us fight. I thought about that for a moment. Watch us fight what? Each other. Or rather, a selected opponent species. They have chosen the Veen. She pulled up a holographic display. The creature rotating slowly in the light above the table had 8 limbs, 4 used for locomotion, 4 that appeared to serve as both arms and secondary legs depending on the situation, and a carapace of overlapping plates the color of old copper. It was approximately 2 meters tall at the shoulder when fully upright, and its visual organs were arranged in a wide band across the front of its head, giving it a field of view that a human would have to turn their entire body to match. They are considered mid-tier combatants by Council classification standards. They have participated in 47 sanctioned demonstrations over the past 3 centuries, and have never suffered what the Council records describe as an anomalous outcome, meaning they always win, meaning the results are always predictable. She paused. The Council does this when they encounter a new species and cannot determine where it fits in their hierarchy. They issue a combat demonstration mandate. The new species fights a mid-tier opponent. The Council observes, measures, and assigns a classification. After classification, the species is assigned trade privileges, territorial limits, and diplomatic standing based on where they placed. I looked at the rotating vein. And where do they expect us to place? Below mid-tier. Most new species do. She closed the display. The Council's concern is that we have been refusing formal classification for 11 years. We have attended summits, we have signed preliminary contact agreements, but every time the formal taxonomy process has come up, our diplomatic teams have found reasons to delay. The Council has run out of patience. So they skipped the diplomacy. They issued a mandate. It has the force of Council law. If we refuse to participate, we are classified as non-compliant, which carries its own set of consequences. She met my eyes. The consequences are not good, Sergeant. I finished my coffee. How many of us are they sending in? 6. 6 soldiers against a mid-tier Vane unit. 8 Vane. The standard demonstration configuration. She said it the way you say something when you are hoping the person across from you will simply accept it and move on. I accepted it. I moved on. There was not much else to do at this point except finish the coffee and go find the other 5 people who had also received orders with no questions attached. The arena was not what I expected. I had imagined something brutal. A pit, maybe. Or a cage. Something that announced its purpose loudly. What the Council had built was more like a theater. The floor of the combat space was smooth and gray, roughly the size of a football field, with scattered structural elements that I recognized after a moment as deliberate terrain features. Low walls, elevation changes, a section of open ground, a section of narrower passages between raised platforms. It was a space designed to be read from above, where the galleries were arranged in ascending tiers around the perimeter, each level filled with alien observers in configurations I could not quite parse. Some of them sat, Some of them hung. At least 2 species appeared to be floating, and all of them were quiet. Not the quiet of anticipation. The quiet of people who have done this many times before and already know more or less how it is going to go. My team assembled at the entry point. Corporal Nina Farrow, who was from a fishing village in Norway, and who had the unnerving habit of smiling slightly more in dangerous situations than in safe ones. Private Owen Daly, who had been a competitive climber before enlisting, and who now assessed every terrain instinctively, cataloging routes and advantages the way other people catalog dinner options. Lance Corporal Priya Holt, combat medic, steady as bedrock. Private First Class Carter Webb, 18 months in, still young enough to be genuinely curious rather than merely professional about unusual situations. And Specialist Gwen Marsh, who had served 2 tours in contested asteroid mining zones and had the 1,000-yard stare of someone who has learned that nothing is ever quite as solid as it looks. The Vane entered from the opposite side. They were larger in person than the hologram had suggested, not because the dimensions were wrong, but because dimensions do not capture the quality of something that is completely at ease with its own capability. The Vane moved with the loose, unhurried confidence of animals that have never seriously needed to worry about anything in their environment. They arranged themselves in a formation near their entry point and turned their wide visual bands toward us, with what I can only describe as polite attention. Not aggression, more the way a professional examines something new. Curious, but not concerned. A tone sounded from somewhere above. The match began. I will not pretend it was easy. The Vane were fast, coordinated, and their carapace deflected our initial engagement attempts in ways that forced us to immediately reconsider our approach. They were clearly experienced in this format. They moved to center ground, held a defensive arrangement, and waited for us to come to them, which is what every mid-tier opponent apparently does when the new species shows up, because mid-tier opponents have learned that new species tend to rush and make predictable errors that can be cleanly recorded and categorized. We did not rush. Owen went up. That was the first thing. Not toward the Vane, but up, onto the raised platforms, moving laterally through the elevated terrain, while the Vane tracked him with their visual bands and adjusted their formation slightly to account for the height differential. It was a small adjustment, perfectly reasonable, and it was exactly enough to open a gap on their left flank that Nina and Carter moved into without anyone asking them to, because we had worked together long enough to read terrain the same way. What followed is harder to describe cleanly. The Van were trained for demonstrations. They knew how to fight, but they had been trained in the context of species that evolved on stable worlds, in stable environments, where survival pressures were consistent and predictable, and your body could develop a specific response to a specific threat over many generations. They had never encountered something that had spent 4 million years improvising. Priya pulled one of the Vane out of formation using their own reach against them. She let it extend toward her, used its momentum, redirected it into a structural pillar. Gwen had already identified that the plates overlapped differently on their lateral joints and had been targeting that specific geometry for 40 seconds before anyone registered that she had a plan. Owen dropped from a platform at an angle that put him between 2 Vane who had been covering each other and were no longer covering each other, because neither of them had expected that to be a viable approach from that direction. The gallery above us went very quiet. Not the quiet of boredom. A different kind of quiet. The kind that happens when a room full of people simultaneously recalibrates what they thought they were watching. The tone sounded again. Not the end of match tone. Something else. A halt signal. We stopped. The Ven stopped. Everyone looked up. A council official in a pale sash was standing at the gallery railing, speaking into a broadcast device. The translation came through my earpiece a second later. The demonstration is temporarily suspended pending procedural review. I looked at Nina. She was still smiling slightly. Procedural review, she said. Apparently, I said. In the far tier of the gallery, past rows of alien delegates who were all very still and very focused on the floor below, I saw something that I could not immediately make sense of. One of the observers, a small, pale species I did not recognize, with elongated limbs and features arranged too symmetrically to look quite natural from a human perspective, was doubled over in their seat. Their attendant was holding a container near them. A containment bag, I realized, the kind used for biological disposal. They were not injured. They had simply seen something that did not agree with them. I stood in the middle of the arena floor and tried to figure out what, exactly, we had done. The holding suite they put us in was comfortable in a careful, institutional way. The furniture was sized for multiple body configurations, which meant most of it was slightly wrong for humans, but they had provided a table and 6 chairs that were approximately correct, and there was a food dispensary along one wall that offered a reasonable approximation of things we could actually eat. Priya immediately began checking everyone for injuries with the quiet efficiency of someone who does not trust anyone to report their own pain accurately. Owen sat on the floor against the wall, which seemed to be his natural state when not in motion. Carter stood at the observation window and looked out at the docking corridor beyond, the way young soldiers look at things when they are trying not to appear as unsettled as they are. Ambassador Osei arrived 20 minutes after we did. She sat down at the table, folded her hands, and looked at us for a moment before speaking. The session has been suspended for deliberation. The council delegates are currently in closed discussion. About what? Nina asked. About you. Osei pulled up a small data display on the table surface. More specifically, about what just happened in that arena, and what it means for how humanity should be classified. She looked around at us. Several delegates have described what they observed as, and I am translating this as accurately as I can, a violation of the proportionality doctrine. The room was quiet for a moment. What is the proportionality doctrine? Gwen asked. It is an informal council principle that in a sanctioned demonstration, the combatants should be, roughly speaking, operating within a recognizable range of each other's capability. That the match should be readable. That observers should be able to identify what is happening and why, in real time, and assign meaning to it. Osei paused. What the council observed today was not readable to them in those terms. I thought about that. We won. Yes. Against a mid-tier opponent. Against a species that has participated in 47 demonstrations and never lost one. She said it carefully, measuring the weight of each word. But that is not the primary concern. The primary concern is the Venn combatants themselves. She brought up a biological readout on the display. I could not interpret most of it, but I could see lines and indicators in several sections highlighted in a color that universally suggests alarm regardless of the species doing the highlighting. The Vein have a distributed nervous system. Their pain response operates across all 8 limbs simultaneously and links to a central processing structure. The way the match unfolded triggered a full system cascade response in 4 of the 8 Vein. Priya looked up from her medical kit. Meaning what? Meaning they experienced a level of simultaneous systemic input that their bodies had no prior reference for. They were not critically harmed. But the Council's medical team describes the neurological readings as unprecedented in 4 centuries of recorded combat demonstrations. Osei looked at us. The Vein have never experienced anything like that before, and the human squad that caused it did not appear to be aware that they were doing anything unusual. That was a fair assessment. We had not been doing anything unusual. We had been doing what we were trained to do. Adjusted for the terrain, adjusted for the opponent, adjusted on the fly as the situation developed. It had felt like a normal, if somewhat high-pressure engagement. Priya set down her kit. How bad were the Vein? They will recover fully, but several of them have been placed in a medically induced rest state while the cascade response is allowed to clear. Osei closed the display. The delegate who was ill in the gallery was a Yeln biologist who was present as a scientific observer. The Yeln are extremely sensitive to other species' distress responses. She was picking up the Vein's neurological signals on a sensory level, and her body was reacting to them. Owen spoke from his place on the floor. She could feel what they were feeling? A partial echo of it. Enough. Osei was quiet for a moment. The Council is now in the position of having issued a combat demonstration mandate, and having gotten a result they cannot categorize. Their taxonomy does not have a slot for what they observed today. And when a bureaucratic system encounters something it cannot categorize, it tends to respond in one of 2 ways. It creates a new category, I said, or it decides the uncategorizable thing is a threat. She met my eyes. There is currently a motion on the Council floor to classify Earth as a restricted Deathworld. That is a designation they reserve for planets that pose unacceptable risk to the broader galactic community. Planets with that designation are placed under permanent quarantine. No contact, no trade, no membership. An invisible wall around your entire solar system that every council species is legally obligated to respect and maintain. The room was quiet again, differently this time. Carter turned from the observation window. They want to wall us off from the rest of the galaxy, because we won a fight they asked us to have. They want to wall you off, Osei said, because they do not understand how you won it, and that frightens them more than losing would have. It was a long night in the holding suite. We ate what the dispensary provided, which was acceptable, if not particularly inspired. Gwen slept sitting upright in her chair with her arms crossed, which is a skill I have always envied. Priya and Nina talked quietly at one end of the table, about something I was not close enough to hear, but the tone of it was the tone of people who are processing something by talking about anything else. Owen did not sleep. He sat against the wall in the dark and looked at the ceiling with the calm attention of a man doing mathematics. I wrote notes in my mission log, which is standard practice, but I found that I did not have language that felt adequate. What do you write when the thing you need to record is not a tactical assessment but a feeling? The feeling was this. I had stood in that arena and performed a competent but unremarkable engagement, and the galaxy had looked at me like I was something it had never imagined. I did not feel like something remarkable. I felt like a soldier who needed more sleep. The communication from Delegate Suro of the Theresi reached my personal comm at 022 hours. It was not an official communication. It came through an informal channel and was marked simply as a request for a private conversation at the individual's discretion. I looked at the name on the display for a moment. I did not know who Delegate Suro was. I did not know anything about the Theresi, but we were not doing anything useful in the holding suite, and it seemed like information might be a better thing to gather than ceiling stare. I went to the small meeting room off the main corridor, where a holographic presence was waiting. A slender figure, pale blue in the projection light, with features that were almost but not quite what a human would call a face. Soft, careful, the kind of creature that had evolved in a place where everything communicated through subtlety, and no one raised their voice. Sergeant Voss, the delegate said. The translation was good, almost no lag. I appreciate your willingness to speak. Sure, I said, because I did not have better language for the situation. I have a question that I am not able to ask in formal session. The delegate paused. I want to ask it with respect, and I want you to know that I am asking it from genuine curiosity, not from a position of judgment. Go ahead. What is it like, Delegate Suro said carefully, to come from a place that wanted to kill you every day of your evolution? I looked at the hologram for a moment. I thought about Colony Pharaoh 6, and the frozen ground, and the morning light that came up gray and thin over the perimeter fence. I thought about hiking in the Welsh hills with my father when I was 8, and the way the weather could change in 20 minutes from clear sky to something that would kill you if you did not know what you were doing. I thought about every piece of training I had ever gone through, every instinct that had been built into me by years of practice, and before the practice by thousands of years of ancestors who had survived things they probably should not have. Normal, I said. I guess it feels normal. Delegate Suro was quiet for a long time. That, the delegate said finally, is exactly what frightens us. The council session reconvened at mid-morning, local station time, and Ambassador Osei had managed to get clearance for our squad to observe from a sealed secondary gallery, a small room with a transparent wall overlooking the main chamber floor, which was a vast, circular space with a high ceiling and a central dais from which speakers addressed the assembly. The chamber was full. Every delegate seat was occupied. I counted 16 different species from where I was standing, probably more that I could not identify at this distance, and the ambient sound of all of them present at once was something between a crowd and a weather system. The motion on the table was still the restricted Deathworld classification. The council speaker, a tall, gray-skinned being in formal layered robes, read the motion's language aloud in the council's trade tongue, and the translation running through my earpiece kept pace in flat, careful English that stripped all the emotional texture from the words but preserved the meaning. And the meaning was, Earth is too dangerous to engage with, too unpredictable to classify, and the safest response to unpredictability at this scale is permanent separation. Several delegates spoke in favor. I watched them and tried to read body language that I had no reference for. Mostly I could tell that they were speaking with conviction, which does not require translation. Then a delegate at the far end of the chamber floor rose from a seat, and the chamber went quieter than it had been before. He was old. That was the first thing I could tell, even from a distance, even looking at a species I had never seen before. The Veil, Osei had whispered to me as soon as he rose, are the longest-standing military civilization in the Council. General Kreth has held his commission for 60 years. He has fought in 3 formally recognized interspecies conflicts, brokered 2 ceasefire agreements, and is the only being in Council history to have served on both sides of a peacekeeping mandate. He does not speak often. When he does, the chamber listens. The general was broad through the chest, with a low center of gravity, and limbs that were thick and deliberate. His face was heavily marked, not by cosmetics but by time and pressure, the way a mountain face is marked, carved by forces that do not hurry. He wore his formal uniform with no decoration, except the rank insignia, and a single small badge that I could not read at distance. He stood at the speaker's dais and said nothing for a moment. Just let the silence settle. "I will not be brief," he said, and his voice, even in translation, was the voice of a man who has spent a lifetime in situations where getting things slightly wrong has consequences, because this matter does not deserve brevity. He looked slowly around the chamber. "I want to tell you a story," he said. "Not a speech, not an argument. A factual account of something that happened to members of my command 30 cycles ago, when I made the decision to send a scouting unit to the edge of the Sol quarantine boundary." The chamber was very still. We had lost contact with a survey probe. Standard equipment failure, most likely. I sent a recovery team, 8 of my best people, in a fully equipped science vessel, with every precaution the handbook required. He paused. 7 of them did not come back. Even through the filtered translation, I could hear the weight in that sentence. Not drama, just the flat fact of it, delivered by someone who has had a very long time to sit with it. The one who did return was a soldier named Adra Selm. She was 26 years old. She had served with my unit for 4 years. She was, and I say this with precision rather than affection, one of the most capable field operatives I have worked with in 60 years of command. He looked at the chamber. Adra Selm did not speak for 6 months after returning to Veil Space. When she was finally able to give her full debrief, it took 11 sessions across 4 weeks. The medical team required her to stop twice when her vital readings became concerning. He let that sit. "I am going to tell you what she told me, and I want you to listen the way you listen to something important, not the way you listen to something you are waiting to argue with." He pulled up a display behind the dais. Not imagery, just data, scientific readouts, charts. The planet Earth has a gravitational field 1/3 stronger than the Veil homeworld, and significantly stronger than the average for Council member planets. The atmospheric pressure at ground level is high enough that unprotected Veil physiology would require active medical support within 4 hours of exposure. The planet's magnetic field and radiation environment are within survivable parameters, but would require shielding that our standard equipment is not fully rated for. He moved to the next data set. The planetary biosphere is what Adra described, and what subsequent long-range surveys have confirmed, as an unbroken chain of competitive pressure from the single-cell level to the apex. He looked at the chamber again. Every tier of life on that planet is in active competition with every other tier. Not in the managed, cyclical way that stable ecosystems operate, the kind of balance that most of our homeworlds achieved hundreds of thousands of years ago. Earth's ecosystem did not stabilize. It accelerated. The biosphere is in a state of continuous evolutionary pressure that has been running at high intensity for approximately 4 billion years, and it has produced, at every level, organisms whose primary design principle is survival under conditions of maximum hostility. He switched displays. The flora. A significant portion of Earth's plant life produces chemical compounds that are actively harmful to other species, not as a defensive response to stimuli, but as a baseline condition. The plants are toxic by default. The fungi, and Earth has an enormous variety of fungal life, include species that parasitize living hosts, modify the behavior of their hosts to serve the fungus's reproductive purposes, and in some cases replace the host's nervous system entirely, while the host continues to move. This is not theoretical. This is documented. The Council's own long-range survey team recorded it before they were also required to stop and compose themselves. A sound moved through the chamber. Not words, just the collective, involuntary reaction of a room full of beings processing information that does not fit their model of how the universe works. The fauna. General Kreth's voice did not rise. It did not need to. I will not attempt to describe all of it. I will describe some of it, and I want you to understand that what I describe is not rare, or exceptional, or a phenomenon from the deep past. It is the current, standard condition of the planet's animal life. He looked at his display. The human species homeworld contains, at last confirmed survey, 6 species of arachnid, whose venom can cause neurological failure in most council species within 2 hours of contact. 12 species of insect, with defensive or predatory mechanisms that would qualify as extreme hazard designations if encountered in a military context. A category of marine organism. The humans call one variant the Portuguese man-of-war, that is technically a colony of individual animals operating as a single body, trailing filaments that deploy venom on contact, that can kill an unprotected swimmer, and continues to deploy venom after the organism itself has died. There are microscopic organisms in the soil of every continent that can cause fatal respiratory conditions. There are organisms in standing water. There are organisms in the air. He looked up from the display. And then there are the large predators. He brought up imagery now. Long-range survey footage, gray and slightly distorted by the distance it had been taken from, but clear enough. A large 4-limbed carnivore, yellow and black, moving through tall grass with liquid economy of motion. A gray marine predator with a mouth that the camera struggled to frame correctly, because the scale kept reading as wrong. A heavily built 4-limbed animal, with a head like a geological feature, moving with unhurried purpose through snow. These, General Kreth said, are not the most dangerous animals on the planet. They are among the largest. The most dangerous animals on Earth, by confirmed Council xenobiology assessment, are significantly smaller. Some of them are nearly invisible. Some of them live inside other animals. He paused. The humans have catalogued thousands of species that can end a life. They have given them all names. They have studied them with genuine intellectual affection. They are, as a species, curious about the things that can harm them. The chamber was silent in a way it had not been before. Adra Seln, General Kreth said quietly, told me that when she finally managed to reach a stable observation point after the ship went down, and I will not describe what happened to the ship, because it is in the classified record, and because several people in this chamber are not rated for that level of biological hazard description. She spent 20 hours in a survival shelter waiting for extraction. During those 20 hours, she counted 43 separate approaches by local fauna. She was not targeted by all of them. Some of them were simply passing through. But 43 organisms, over 20 hours, each of them capable of ending her life if she had made the wrong decision at the wrong moment. He looked around the chamber slowly. Adra said to me, when she was finally able to speak about it without stopping, that the worst part was not the danger. The worst part was the sound. She said Earth is never quiet. It is always, in every direction, alive and moving, and competing, and hunting, and eating, and adapting. She said she could hear it all night through the shelter walls. She said it sounded like the planet itself had a pulse. He stepped back from the dais slightly. Now, I have told you what the planet is. Let me tell you what the planet made. He looked at the chamber. The humans that stood in that arena yesterday did not do anything that their training manuals describe as special. Ambassador Osei's office provided the Council with full access to human military training protocols, and I have read them. What those 6 soldiers did yesterday is, in human military terms, a basic field engagement conducted at standard proficiency. They improvised because their training specifically develops improvisation. They adapted in real time because their culture of survival has, over thousands of years, selected for real-time adaptation as a primary trait. They found the structural advantages in the terrain, because finding structural advantages in terrain is what you do when you live on a planet where the terrain itself might be trying to harm you. He looked at the chamber one more time. We, General Kreth said, and his voice was very quiet now. The quiet of something being said that has been thought about for a long time. Have no framework for this. Every species in this chamber evolved in an environment that, at some point in the deep past, became safe enough that intelligence was a good investment. We developed thought because thought was more efficient than physical capability for navigating our worlds. The pressure decreased. We grew. We built. We reached the stars. He paused. The humans also reached the stars, but their pressure did not decrease. It adapted with them. They became intelligent while remaining physically capable. They developed empathy, art, philosophy, music, and medicine, while living on the surface of a planet that was, at every moment of their evolutionary history, attempting to kill them in a variety of creative ways. They did not choose to become what they are. They were made this way by 4 billion years of the most intense selection pressure we have ever recorded in a sapient species' home environment. He looked at the motion on the chamber's formal record. The proposal before this chamber is to classify Earth as a restricted death world and seal it behind a permanent quarantine. I understand the instinct. I do not oppose it entirely as a precaution. But I want this chamber to understand something clearly before it votes. He stood very still. A quarantine wall is only effective if the thing behind it does not eventually decide to leave. The humans have already left. Once. They built starships on a planet that provided them with almost no cooperative assistance and a great deal of active resistance. And they came out into the galaxy and asked to be treated as equals. They have been patient with us. They have attended summits. They have waited 11 years while we tried to decide what box to put them in. He looked at the display one more time, then turned it off. I recommend, he said, that we decide what kind of relationship we want with them before they decide the question for us. He walked back to his seat. The chamber did not immediately speak. It simply sat with what had been said, the way you sit with something heavy that has been placed in your hands, and you are not yet sure whether you have the strength to hold it. I stood in the secondary gallery and looked at the back of General Kreth's head and thought, he just described my species from the outside. He just described the world where I was born, and the people who shaped me, and the planet I call home, as though reading from an alien threat assessment, and every single thing he said was accurate. It sat strangely in my chest. Not pride exactly, something more complicated than pride. Something that felt like being seen for the first time, by eyes that were not sure whether to run. They did not vote that day. They called a recess, which stretched through the evening and into the next morning. And during that time the holding suite became something different. The formal sessions were suspended. The informal corridor conversations were not. The first knock on the suite door came at early afternoon, local time. I answered it to find a small being in a white lab coat several sizes too large for them, the Yelm biologist, Dr. Pava, who had been ill in the gallery during the demonstration. She was accompanied by a translation assistant and was carrying, with both hands, a datapad the size of a dinner tray. I would like to ask some questions, she said, if you are willing. I looked at her for a moment. She looked back at me with eyes that were very large and very dark, and currently expressing what I was fairly sure was a combination of intense scientific curiosity and something approaching residual distress. She was small, perhaps 1.5 meters tall, with thin limbs and a delicate frame that made her look like she had been built for a quieter universe than the one she was currently navigating. Come in, I said. She sat at the table across from Priya, who had stayed in the suite while the others explored the docking corridors, and she placed her datapad on the table and looked at both of us with careful attention. The Yeln homeworld, she began, has a disease burden of approximately 12 known pathogens that affect sapient life. All 12 are well understood. Treatments exist for 11 of them. The 12th has not been recorded in active form for over 2 centuries. She paused. I have been reading the preliminary xenobiology survey data on Earth's pathogen environment. How many did you get to? Priya asked. I stopped at 400. Dr. Pava was quiet for a moment. Is that number accurate? The survey data lists over 400 distinct pathogenic organisms capable of causing serious illness in human adults. Priya considered. That's probably conservative, she said. The survey data is a few years old, and it might not include regional variations. She saw the look on the doctor's face and added, most of them aren't a serious day-to-day concern. We have immune systems and medicine. Your immune system, Dr. Pava said carefully, with the tone of someone reading from a document they found astonishing, attacks pathogens using a response mechanism that involves controlled inflammation, targeted cellular destruction, and a memory function that allows it to recognize and destroy previously encountered threats with significantly increased efficiency. Yes, Priya said. Your immune system learns. Yes. And when it makes errors, Dr. Pava said, it sometimes attacks the body's own tissue. That happens. We have treatments for it. It attacks itself, Dr. Pava said, as though this was the final detail that had moved the whole picture from alarming to something beyond alarming, and the body continues to function. Priya nodded. There was a short silence. I am not asking these questions to be unkind, Dr. Pava said. I am asking them because I am a biologist, and I have spent 20 years studying sapient life, and I have never encountered a biological system that operates under the pressures yours does and continues to produce functional, social, curious beings. She looked at her datapad. How do your children survive childhood? Carefully, Priya said, with a lot of help. But they do survive it. Most of them. Most of them, yes. Dr. Pava wrote something on her datapad. Then she looked up. The survey data includes a section on childhood diseases, illnesses that specifically target young humans and that, in the historical record, caused significant mortality before the development of medical interventions. She read from the pad. One of them, measles, is listed as having been responsible for millions of deaths across recorded human history. The survey notes that a vaccine was developed. The survey also notes that the virus continues to exist and continues to be capable of infection in unvaccinated individuals. She looked at me. The virus still exists. Yes, I said. You did not eliminate it. We eliminated it from the human population in most places. It still exists. On your planet. In nature. It still circulates. Dr. Pava wrote more notes. She seemed to be writing the kind of notes a person writes when they are processing something that does not fit into any category they currently possess, and they are constructing a new category in real time with their pen. Owen came back from the corridor around mid-afternoon and found 3 more delegates waiting at the suite door. He let them in with the uncomplicated hospitality of someone who has learned that unusual situations are usually less dangerous if you treat them as normal. The suite filled up slowly. Nina made coffee from the dispensary and handed it around without asking anyone's preferences, which is either a very human thing to do or a very Nina thing to do, and either way most of the delegates accepted it with careful hands and small, careful sips. The Theresi delegate, Suro, arrived at late afternoon. I had met Suro already, through the holographic call, but in person they were more present, a being of such gentle structure that they seemed to apologize for occupying space simply by standing in it. They sat beside me at the edge of the room and spoke quietly while the louder conversations continued around us. I have been thinking about what you said, Suro said, that it feels normal. It does, I said. It always has. I come from a world, Suro said, where the most dangerous animal is a small burrowing creature that produces a mild toxin when disturbed. It causes discomfort for approximately 2 hours. No lasting harm. They paused. When I was young, my education included a full safety module on this creature. How to identify its burrows, how to step carefully, how to treat the sting if it occurred. Suro looked at their hands. That was the apex of what my planet required me to be careful about. One small animal with a mild toxin. I did not say anything. There did not seem to be anything useful to add. The survey data on Earth, Suro said, includes an entry for an organism called a bullet ant. It produces a sting that human reports describe as the most intense pain a human can experience from an insect. The pain lasts, according to the reports, for approximately 24 hours. They paused. And there is a documented human cultural practice, in one region of your planet, in which young people wear gloves filled with these insects as part of a coming-of-age ritual. I've heard of that, I said. They do it willingly. It proves they can handle it, I said. That they're ready. Ready for what? I thought about it. For everything else, I suppose. Suro was quiet for a long time. Around us, the room was full of quiet, careful conversations. Alien delegates and human soldiers, finding language for things that had no translation ready, and making do with approximation and patience, which is maybe the most human thing of all. Carter came and sat near me later that evening, when most of the delegates had gone and the suite was quieter. He was 18 months into service, and still had the look of someone who is regularly surprised by the distance between what they expected and what they found. He sat for a while without saying anything, and then he said, "Do you think they're afraid of us?" "Some of them," I said. "Yes. Should they be?" I thought about that for a long time, about General Kreth's voice in the chamber, about Adra Seln in a survival shelter, counting 43 animals in the dark, about my planet, alive and noisy and competitive and beautiful, with its bullet ants and its weather, and its 400 pathogens, and its people who hiked back into the mountains the very next weekend because they liked the mountains. "I think," I said, "that the ones who are afraid of us are afraid for the same reason you're afraid of something you don't understand. Not because it's proven it wants to hurt you, just because it's possible that it could." I looked at the wall. The ones who aren't afraid of us are the ones who've decided to learn us instead of avoid us. And I think that's probably the smarter option. Carter nodded. He thought about it. Then he said, "Do you think they'll vote for the wall?" "I don't know," I said. He nodded again. He went to sleep soon after, which is what you do when you are 18 months into service, and you have learned that worrying about outcomes you cannot influence is a waste of energy you might need later. I stayed awake a little longer, listening to the quiet hum of the station, thinking about the kind of quiet that Dr. Pava had described Adra Seln describing, the sound of earth through shelter walls, all of it alive and moving and competing and breathing. I had grown up in that sound. I had never thought of it as remarkable. It was just the sound of home. The final vote of the Galactic Council was not what any of us expected, and looking back on it now, I think the reason it went the way it did was because of something that is very difficult to build a case for in a formal debate, but is very easy to demonstrate in a room full of people who are paying attention. The session reconvened the following morning. The gallery was more crowded than it had been the day before. Word had moved through the station the way it always does, informally, through the conversations that happen in corridors and dispensary queues and the edges of meetings where the official agenda is not the one that matters. There were observers present who had not been there before. Some of them were very clearly not delegates. Some of them were, and I only know this because Osei told me afterward, very senior members of species that had not formally engaged with the council in decades, who had come specifically because they had heard what General Kreth said. The motion for restricted Deathworld classification was read again. The speaker asked for discussion. The Durath delegate spoke first. The Durath are the closest thing the council has to what a human might call a traditional warrior culture. Large, organized, deeply hierarchical, and genuinely respected for their military record across several centuries. The Durath delegate was a senior commander named something I could not reproduce phonetically, whom I had encountered the previous evening in the docking corridor. He had cornered me outside the suite door, and the conversation had been brief. He had looked at me with the flat assessment of a professional, evaluating another professional, and he had said, "Are you a threat to the stability of this council?" I had looked back at him for a long moment. "We are trying not to be," I said, "but you should probably stop poking us to find out." He had looked at me for another moment. Then he had walked away without speaking. In the chamber he rose and said that the Durath delegation would not support the restricted Deathworld classification. He said it without elaboration, in the way that military cultures sometimes deliver their most significant statements, stripped of context, offered as a fact, and left to stand on its own weight. The chamber absorbed it. After the Durath, others spoke, not all of them in humanity's favor. Several delegates maintained that the classification was appropriate, that the unpredictability demonstrated in the arena was precisely what the taxonomy system was designed to flag, that the purpose of the council's hierarchy was to create order, and that things which resisted categorization were not compatible with that purpose. They were not wrong, exactly. They were just working from a model that had never accounted for Earth. Delegate Suro of the Theresi spoke. They were brief and quiet, and what they said was this: "We have always maintained that the purpose of council taxonomy is to protect species from each other. I believe that purpose is best served not by building walls between us and what we do not understand, but by building understanding. I have spent an evening in conversation with the human delegation. I have not been harmed. I have not been threatened. I have been given coffee. They paused. I support full membership. General Kreth did not speak again. He did not need to. Ambassador Osei was called to the floor, and she made a careful, precise argument for full council membership under a modified framework that she had been drafting. I later learned for several years. She had always known this moment would come. She had just not known when. The framework proposed something new. A classification category called Crucible World, defined as a planet of origin for sapient life, under conditions of exceptional evolutionary pressure, with full membership rights, full sovereignty, and a standing advisory role in any council conflict arbitration that involved physical engagement. The vote was held. It took longer than the normal voting format, because the council's recording system had to create a new entry field for the new classification. They had never had to do that before. The system required manual authorization at 3 separate levels to add a category that did not previously exist. While the authorization was being processed, the chamber sat in a particular kind of silence that felt like the silence after something irreversible has happened, and everyone present is aware of it. The authorization completed. The vote was recorded. Earth was classified as Crucible World, Category Primus, full membership, unrestricted sovereignty, contact protocol, voluntary and bilateral only. Osei came to us in the secondary gallery with the result. She did not celebrate. She told us the outcome in her careful, measured voice, and then she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "The council has never created a new classification before." "How long has the council been operating?" Gwen asked. 412 years, Osei said. The room was quiet for a moment after that. General Kreth found me in the corridor outside the gallery, as the session was closing, and the chamber was beginning to empty. He was alone, which I suspected was unusual for someone of his rank and record. He looked at me for a moment with the flat, assessing gaze of someone who has spent a lifetime measuring people, and then he held out a small data chip. "Read this," he said. I looked at the chip. "What is it?" "The full Veil Xenobiology dossier on Earth." He held it out until I took it. 60 years of long-range survey data, Audra's debrief transcripts, the complete biological hazard assessment, and the section my research team titled Observations on Human Behavioral Adaptation under Cumulative Stress. That section alone is 200 pages. He looked at me steadily. "Read it, not because you need the information, because you should know what you look like from out here." I looked at the chip in my hand. "Why are you giving this to me?" General Kreth was quiet for a moment. "Because Adra Seln recovered," he said. After 6 months of silence, she spoke. After 11 sessions of debrief, she filed her full report. After 2 years of careful treatment, she returned to active service. She is currently a senior field commander in the Veil Eastern Frontier. He paused. I asked her, some years later, if she would go back to Earth, if we could arrange safe passage and full protective equipment. He looked at me with something in his face that I did not have a name for. She said yes, immediately, without hesitating. She said there was nothing in the universe like it. He held my gaze for one more moment. Then he walked away. He walked the way old soldiers walk, like someone who has been carrying something heavy for a very long time and has simply made peace with the weight of it. I looked at the data chip for a while. I read it on the transport home. It took 2 days, which was approximately how long the journey back to the frontier took, and I did not sleep much during those 2 days. The document was organized into sections: atmospheric analysis, gravitational data, biosphere overview, specific hazard assessments by category, historical survival data on the 7 Veil survey members who had not returned, and Audra Seln's full debrief transcripts, which were the most difficult reading I have ever attempted. Not because they described anything I did not know about Earth, because they described everything I knew about Earth, and reflected it back to me through the eyes of someone who had encountered it without any preparation, and been nearly undone by it. And in that reflection I saw my home as I had never seen it. Vast, they said, loud, relentlessly, impossibly alive in every direction, a planet that did not pause, a biosphere that did not rest, an ecology so deeply committed to the project of living that it had produced, at the top of its 4 billion-year chain, beings who had looked at all of it and decided it was worth staying for. The section on human behavioral adaptation under stress was the longest section in the document. It covered things I recognized from the outside of them, but had never thought to examine closely. The human tendency to make friends quickly under pressure. The human habit of using humor in dangerous situations. The human preference for returning to challenging environments voluntarily, not out of recklessness, but out of something the Vale researchers had struggled to name and finally settled on calling active belonging. The sense that you are from a place, and that the place made you, and that the difficulty of it is not a burden but a source. They had included, in a supplementary appendix, some examples of human cultural products that had been intercepted through long-range radio surveys. Music, mostly. Some written literature. A selection of what appeared to be comedy. Recordings of humans in a room, one of them speaking and others responding with laughter. The Vale researchers had noted that they could not determine what the humans found funny in these recordings, but that the recordings were consistent with a species that had developed the capacity to find things amusing, even when those things were frightening, painful, or deeply inconvenient, and that this capacity seemed central to how the species managed the psychological load of living in the environment it lived in. I stepped off the transport back onto Colony Pharaoh 6 in the early afternoon, local time. It was raining, which it usually is on Pharaoh 6, a cold, flat rain that comes down without enthusiasm and stays without apology. The perimeter fence was running its standard checks. The colony lights were on against the gray. A maintenance technician named Barry was crouched at the base of the outer fence, clearing away the remains of a local predator that had approached the barrier too closely during the night. He did not look up. It was not the first predator he had cleared from that fence. It would not be the last. I stood in the rain for a moment and looked at the colony, at the functional, unglamorous reality of humans living somewhere they had not been invited, and making it work by sheer persistence and the accumulated habit of dealing with whatever showed up. The dispensary lights were on. Somebody had put a handmade paper sign on the common room door. The generator was making its usual low complaint. In the distance, past the perimeter, whatever passed for wildlife on Pharaoh 6 was going about its business in the gray. I went inside. I made coffee. I sat down at the small desk in the corner of the operations room and opened my mission log. I wrote the tactical debrief first, because that is what the form requires. Times, locations, engagements, outcomes. Clean and factual and easy to file. Then I sat for a while with the cursor blinking at me, because the part that actually needed recording was not the part the form had fields for. I thought about Delegate Suro asking me what it was like to come from a place that had wanted to kill me. I thought about General Kreth handing me a chip that contained, among other things, a 200-page analysis of what humans do when things get hard. I thought about Adra Selm, who had gone to Earth without preparation and come back half undone, and then had said yes when someone asked her if she wanted to go back. I thought about the sound of home, the way it never stopped, the way that it always seemed, to me, like the most natural thing in the world. I wrote one last line in the mission log, not because anyone would read it, but because it felt like the right way to close an account. I think the council expected us to be monsters. What I don't think they expected was that we'd be entirely comfortable being exactly what we are. I saved the file. I finished my coffee. Outside the window, the rain kept coming down, steady and indifferent, the way weather does when it does not care whether you appreciate it or not. I appreciated it anyway. That has always been the thing about us. We cannot help it.